What if a single letter could rekindle the fire on an entire continent? When a golden royal envelope landed on President Ibrahim Traoré's desk, nobody expected it to cause a storm that would bring the old powers of Europe shaking. Stay till the end, because what he did next changed Africa's story forever. The envelope was immaculate, sealed with the crest of the British crown, shimmering like a gift, but carrying the weight of an insult centuries old. Inside lay Queen Camilla's words, polite on the surface, poisonous beneath. An invitation, she called it, but everyone in that room knew what it really was, a demand. She wanted Traoré in London, at a Commonwealth ceremony, before the world, to retract his condemnation of European colonial crimes, to apologize, essentially, for telling the truth. The audacity left his aides speechless. It was as if the clock had turned back to a time when African leaders were still supposed to fall to their knees before any monarch who had once ruled their forefathers at gunpoint. Traoré read the letter again, his jaw tight, his pulse steady, feeling the weight of generations behind him. The letter ended with a deadline: respond within 72 hours. The threat that followed was vague, unmistakably menacing. The timing was no coincidence, either. He had just returned from Burkina Faso's northern provinces, where archaeologists were unearthing mass graves from the colonial era, where old mothers wept over skeletons that might belong to fathers they never met. His so-called anti-colonial speeches weren't political theater, only truth spoken from open wounds. And now this? A royal order demanding silence. The expectation that he would bow and pretend history was some misunderstanding between friends. His chief of staff stood by the window, pale, knowing this moment would define not just their nation, but perhaps the continent's relationship with its past oppressors. Outside, life went on, markets buzzed, engines hummed, and children laughed, utterly unaware that inside the presidential office sat a letter that could reshape Africa's destiny. Traoré folded it carefully, the motion calm, almost ceremonial. He knew that some orders were meant to be refused, and likewise some refusals were meant to echo through history. A day later, the lights of a television studio blazed, almost like interrogations, but Traoré remained eerily unperturbed. Military fatigues instead of a suit, a conscious act, a reminder of where he came from. Before him, on the table, lay the royal letter, its seal facing the cameras as if a relic of a dead empire. The world was watching. The journalists waited. And then he spoke. "I have received an order," he started off, his voice firm as iron, "from Queen Camilla of England, demanding that I apologize for speaking the truth about colonialism." He raised the letter to the cameras, brazen, arrogant, retro. She believes she can still command African presidents as her ancestors commanded African chiefs, that we are still children in need of correction. Then came the line that would travel the world. "To Her Majesty and to the world, I say this: those days are dead, and they will never return." Like thunder, the word struck. Reporters burst into a round of questions. A mere glance from him quietened them all down. "Africa," he said, "will never again apologize for refusing to be robbed. We will never disguise theft as partnership, nor call exploitation friendship. We seek peace, but we will not kneel." He paused, his eyes steady. "Burkina Faso only bows for the truth, for justice, and for the memory of our ancestors who dreamed of this day." Within an hour, the video had circled the globe 7 times. Social media exploded, hashtags blazing across screens from Lagos to Harlem. In Ouagadougou, the streets came alive before sunrise. Students, market women, taxi drivers, thousands flooding into the streets, waving flags, chanting his words as if they were scripture. It wasn't protest, it was awakening. Murals of Traoré appeared overnight, painted by anonymous hands, fueled by pride, by rage, by hope. But in London and Brussels, it was panic. Behind polished doors, ministers gathered, faces pale, voices cold. They called it an emergency session, but it was really fear disguised as diplomacy. The British Foreign Secretary slammed sanction proposals onto a table, spitting words about discipline and economic correction. French diplomats joined in, calling him reckless, childish, as though the president of an African nation had no right to speak for his people. And yet, the more they threatened, the stronger the movement grew. Across 38 African cities, youth poured into the streets chanting in Swahili, Yoruba, Amharic, Wolof united in defiance. They painted Traoré's face on buildings, wore red berets in honor of Sankara, and turned silence into song. This was no longer about one man. It was about generations reclaiming their voice. And in the fumbling of old powers for control, one thing became clear. This was the moment Africa stopped asking for permission to be free. If you think history is being rewritten right before our eyes, hit that subscribe button, share this story, and let the world know. Some letters might be written in gold, but it's courage that writes history. In Lagos, a 17-year-old girl climbed atop a car and lifted a megaphone to her lips. Her voice shook, but her conviction did not. She told the crowd that if standing tall meant standing with Ibrahim Traoré, then Nigeria's future stood with Burkina Faso, no matter what timid politicians whispered to Western diplomats behind closed doors. These festivities were not naive. Everyone in that place understood the risk. They knew what they meant by sanctions and economic pressure. But they had started using a new kind of mathematics, one where self-respect weighed more than foreign aid, and dignity could not be measured in dollars or euros. That same evening, Traoré emerged in front of the swelling crowd outside the presidential compound. Gone was the military uniform this time. He wore a simple, traditional robe. Calm, grounded, yet strong with quiet strength. He spoke like an elder brother rather than a head of state. "They threaten us with poverty," he said, his voice carrying over the sea of people, as if we haven't already survived it. "They give us aid with one hand and take our gold and our land with the other, then call us ungrateful when we ask for fairness instead of charity." The response was thunderous. The speech became an anthem across Africa for a generation that refused to inherit their parents' silence. With the dawn, an old woman arrived in Ouagadougou, an 83-year-old woman by the name of Aminata Sawadogo. Time and struggle had etched each line on her face. She was a map of endurance. It had taken her 7 days to get here from her village, part of the way riding a motorbike, the rest on foot when the roads became dust. She carried a small wooden box in her hands wrapped in a faded cloth the color of dried blood. Inside, her father's medal was enclosed, a relic the French had torn from around his neck the day they executed him for refusing to harvest their cotton without pay. She stood her ground when the guards tried to stop her. "Tell him," she said, "Aminata Sawadogo carries her father's medal." Moments later, Traoré himself stepped outside. He took off his red beret and knelt before her. Cameras clicked as she opened the box to reveal the tarnished medal, its ribbons still stained with blood which time had not washed out. "My father wore this," she said softly, tears tracing her cheeks, "the day he told the commandant that Burkinabe hands would no longer build French wealth while Burkinabe children starved. They killed him for those words, but before he died, he told me someone would come who would speak them again without fear." She hoisted the medal and draped it over Traoré's neck. It wasn't an ornament. It was a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. He embraced her and whispered, "Madam, I wear this not for honor, but for responsibility. Your father's courage lives in every word we speak against those who still think Africa exists for their comfort." She smiled, the weight of decades finally lifting. Around them, the silent crowd realized that this was more than ceremony, but history making the corrections. A few days later, encrypted files started circulating online. They originated from a conscience-stricken diplomat in Brussels who could no longer stomach the hypocrisy of his superiors. The documents confirmed what many had suspected. Queen Camilla's letter had not been born of royal pride, but of corporate panic. 3 massive European mining companies, names long associated with colonial extraction, had lost billions after Burkina Faso's new sovereignty laws ended their sweetheart contracts for lithium and cobalt. They had pressured governments, which in turn pressured the palace to discipline Traoré before other African nations followed his lead. One cable, signed by a senior royal advisor, made the agenda plain: the Traore situation needs immediate correction before his resource nationalism spreads. Leverage Commonwealth protocols to discourage similar movements. Another memo even listed potential revenue losses in tons of cobalt, copper, and rare earth minerals, reducing human dignity to a balance sheet entry. The leaks spread fast. In a matter of hours, African social media exploded in both fury and pride. University students projected the cables onto government buildings. Artists painted murals of puppeteered crowns controlled by corporate hands. Economists published data proving that if Africa kept its own resources, it could fund the hospitals and schools foreign aid had never truly built. The next time Traoré faced the press, the metal emanada had given him shown beneath his jacket. "These documents prove what our ancestors already knew," he said. "Colonialism didn't die. It learned new words and wore new suits. But they have misjudged our generation. We will not trade dignity for approval. We will build prosperity that serves our children, not foreign shareholders." It was not a polite applause. It was a liberating one. Sounded like chains breaking. Days later, the African Union convened an emergency session in Addis Ababa. 54 flags hung in the Great Hall beneath portraits of liberation heroes. The atmosphere felt half parliament, half cathedral. As Ibrahim Traoré walked toward the podium, the sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows bridging past and future. The cameras rolled. Every delegate knew they were witnessing something historic, either the birth of a new era or the isolation of a defiant man. "My brothers and sisters," he began in a steady, powerful voice, "I stand before you not to seek validation from those who've always measured our worth by the resources they take from us. We've been taught to measure progress by their applause, to call ourselves successful when they label us reasonable, safe, good for their investments, while our children study under trees without roofs." He paused, allowing silence to do its work. But dignity cannot be negotiated quarterly. Sovereignty is not something we request permission to exercise. Our ancestors did not bleed and die, so we could govern nations while someone else controls our destiny. The delegation stood one by one. First Burkina Faso, then Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Congo, until the whole hall rose in thunderous unity. The speech lasted for 37 minutes that felt both endless and fleeting. Every sentence was not rhetoric, but correction reclaiming the definition twisted by centuries of dependency. Traoré spoke of lithium and cobalt as inheritance, of sovereignty as survival, and of a continent ready at last to own its tomorrow. He quoted Sankara and Lumumba, connecting their interrupted visions to this moment of possible resurrection, reminding leaders that their legitimacy derived not from Western approval, but from the welfare of their people. When he concluded by planting both hands firmly on the podium and declaring, "Africa will rise on her own terms, or she will rise on her knees no longer," the applause lasted so long that the translators stopped attempting to speak over it. Within hours, the speech gathered 500 million views across platforms as it was shared by everyone from Nairobi taxi drivers to Sorbonne professors. An articulation of dignity generations waited to hear, spoken with such uncompromising clarity. The groundswell of support emerged first from unexpected quarters, rippling outward in concentric circles from a stone dropped into still water that had waited centuries to be disturbed. In Port-au-Prince, thousands of Haitians poured into the streets carrying portraits of Traoré alongside images of Toussaint Louverture, their chants merging revolutionary history with contemporary defiance as they marched past the ruins of colonial fortresses their ancestors had conquered. The sound systems in Kingston blasted the African Union speech between reggae classics. Bob Marley's redemption songs found their prophetic fulfillment in this Burkinabe soldier who refused to bow. From Trinidad to Jamaica, from Barbados to Grenada, Caribbean nations whose independence had been economic fiction watched Traoré demonstrate what sovereignty actually required, their own compromised leaders suddenly facing populations demanding similar courage. But the most stunning validation came from within the colonizers' heartland itself, in the form of thousands of British citizens who made their way to Trafalgar Square beneath Nelson's column, holding banners that read, "Not in our name," and "Camilla doesn't speak for us." Students occupied London's colonial museums, demanding that artifacts be returned to nations. Traore was teaching to reclaim their dignity beyond stolen treasures displayed as educational curiosities. In Birmingham, a grandmother held her father's medals, won in Britain's African campaigns, in trembling hands before cameras, declaring tearfully that he had been lied to about spreading civilization when they'd merely been enforcers for theft. The protests spread to Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, cities built on wealth extracted from continents, now finding their voice through a leader who had turned a diplomatic incident into a moral reckoning that transcended geography. Asian nations watched with recognition born from their own colonial memories. Indian parliament members praised Traoré's stand. Vietnamese officials drew parallels to their own independence struggles. Malaysian activists organized solidarity rallies outside British embassies. Indonesia's foreign minister went on record to say that Traoré was articulating what the whole global South had internalized but been too diplomatically circumspect to articulate with such clarity. Even in European capitals, politicians who had built careers on progressive rhetoric were finding themselves exposed by Traoré's example. Their constituents asking why they had never challenged the structural inequalities this African president was dismantling through moral authority alone. The coalition that coalesced around Traoré's defiance represented something unprecedented in post-colonial history, not just African unity, but global recognition that a stand against Queen Camilla's arrogance was actually a stand for human dignity across race and geography. Phone calls flooded Ouagadougou's presidential palace from labor unions, student movements, and indigenous groups worldwide, each seeing their own struggle reflected in Burkina Faso's refusal to accept subordination as the permanent condition of formerly colonized peoples. It was a retreat that came not through official channels, but through cracks in the palace facade, leaked first to a junior BBC correspondent who had been covering African affairs with unusual honesty. The statement arrived at dawn London time, when Buckingham Palace communication staff were still asleep and couldn't prevent its release. Queen Camilla's words passed through layers of royal protocol, yet unable to completely mask the capitulation beneath, recognized that her previous communication had failed to appreciate the complex historical context between Britain and African nations, particularly on matters that remained sources of profound pain for communities still living with colonial legacies and consequences. The statement fell short of a direct apology, but was something unprecedented in modern royal history, a reigning monarch forced to publicly retreat from demands made upon a former colonial territory. The power dynamics which had governed for centuries suddenly were visibly inverted. Within Ouagadougou's presidential compound, Traoré received word of the withdrawal while reviewing agricultural reports with his cabinet, the aide who brought the announcement finding him exactly where he had been when the original order arrived, unchanged in posture or priority. He read the palace statement once, set it aside without comment, and returned to discussing millet yields and irrigation projects as his ministers exchanged glances that mixed triumph with understanding. That their president had never doubted this outcome because he had been operating from principles rather than calculations. Later, when the press secretary gathered journalists, it was a response by Traoré that lasted barely 90 seconds. Wasn't it always in that very tone that made bombshells sound like simple observations about weather? Africa requires no statement of acknowledgement for our pain because we are no longer waiting for validation from those who caused it. Our dignity is inherent rather than granted, and Burkina Faso will continue building prosperity for its people regardless of what palaces across oceans choose to recognize. The international response predictably split along fault lines that Traoré's stand had exposed and widened into chasms impossible to ignore anymore. European newspapers tried to put a spin on Camilla's withdrawal as gracious reconciliation with editorials praising her statesmanship while avoiding the word retreat. Their columnists did linguistic gymnastics to obscure the fact that an African president had just checkmated the British monarchy in full view of history. African social media erupted in celebrations that felt less like victory over an external opponent and more like a collective awakening to power they'd possessed all along but been made to doubt. Traoré's refusal had proved that the emperor wore no clothes once you stopped pretending the nakedness was regal garments. In Caribbean capitals and Asian cities, in Latin American universities and indigenous communities worldwide, the palace withdrawal registered as confirmation that the post-colonial order was finally shifting beneath everyone's feet. Traoré had planted seeds in Freedom Square before the Baobab ceremony even happened, roots already spreading through the consciousness of every person who had ever been told to be grateful for civilization delivered through violence. His stand against Camilla had watered revolutionary gardens that would bloom for generations in soil finally freed from kneeling. In the center of Freedom Square, at dawn breaking over Ouagadougou, was a sapling baobab that reached no higher than a grown man's waist, its tender trunk wrapped in cloth bearing the colors of every African nation, its roots nestled in soil mixed from all 54 countries, carried by delegates who knew they planted more than a tree. Thousands gathered in a silence that was cathedral sacred, their presence making the square holy ground where, through modern hands, something ancient was being reborn. And when Traoré knelt to pack earth around those roots, every person who watched knew they were witnessing the exact moment Africa stopped asking permission to stand tall. The president's hands moved with a farmer's efficiency rather than ceremonial flourish, dirt collecting under his fingernails as he worked this man who had refused a queen, now tending growth that would outlive empires and palaces both. Around him stood the Burkinabe grandmother, clutching her father's liberation medal, the village elders who had shared ancestor stories, youth activists whose celebrations had shaken capitals, all of them reflected in this single act of planting what could not be uprooted again. When Traoré finally stood and addressed the gathered thousands, his words carried no triumph or vindication, just the quiet certainty of someone stating facts about sunrise or harvest. We plant this tree not to mark victory over those who demanded our submission, but to remind ourselves that our roots were here long before their ships arrived, and will remain long after their demands fade into footnotes. He spoke of the nature of the baobab, how it stored water through droughts and provided shelter through storms, how its fruit nourished and its bark healed, how it gives without depleting itself. And everyone knew he was talking about the Africa they were building together, the Africa that had always been there beneath colonial fantasy and extraction's greed. The tree would grow slowly, as all meaningful things do, its branches eventually spreading wide enough to shade the entire square. Generations yet unborn would gather in that shade, telling stories about the president who had shown them dignity was never negotiable. Across the continent and throughout the diaspora, millions watched the ceremony through screens that transmitted more than images. They carried the frequency of transformation humming through fiber optic cables and satellite signals into hearts that had been waiting lifetimes for this permission to stand straight. They saw themselves in Traoré's dirt-stained hands and unwavering posture, recognized their own journeys in this narrative of refusal and replanting, and understood that his stand against Camilla had been their stand too. Collective spines straightening after centuries bent under burdens that were never theirs to carry. The baobab would be a place of pilgrimage and a symbol too, but its deeper roots were spreading now through the consciousness of everyone who had witnessed this moment, everyone who had learned that sovereignty was claimed through living it, not through asking for it. As water was poured over the newly planted sapling and traditional songs rose into the morning air, Traoré stepped back into the crowd rather than staying elevated, just another farmer tending Africa's garden, just another ancestor planting for descendants he would never meet. And in that humble disappearance into collective action lay the completion of the revolution, the leader who had shown that true power required no throne, no crown, no validation from palaces built on stolen wealth, only unshakable clarity about who you were and what you would never again kneel for. And Africa, witness to it all, knew that finally she had come home to herself. Will you stand in your own truth as firmly as Traoré stood in his? Subscribe to watch more stories of those who refuse to bend.